From a cartel boss's motorcycle escape tunnel to cons who dressed up in drag and mailed themselves to freedom. Join me as we explore the most insanely creative ways that people have escaped from prison. A tight squeeze. The benefits of yoga are truly endless. Flexibility, mindfulness, being able to escape from jail. Wait, what? Well, back in 1990, a South Korean yoga master called Choi Ga-bak was arrested after stealing around $70,000 from gold stores and gas stations. After being caught, he was transported to Daegu prison on a police transport bus. But when the driver got stuck in traffic, Choi unfastened his seatbelt, used his yogi strength to rip an iron bar from the window, and successfully squeezed his body through the 7.8-inch gap that it created. He then went on the run for 2 days until undercover police spotted and recaptured him. But after serving his sentence, Choi didn't give up his life of crime, and 22 years later he was arrested for another robbery and locked up in Daegu Danbu police station. His cell was far more secure than the bus, but 5 days later he escaped again by covering his body in oil and squeezing through his food hatch. Grease Lightning got through the 5.9-inch gap in under a minute, and as the guards were asleep, he was able to walk straight out of the station and go on the run for 6 days. Eventually, he was recaptured in the city of Muryang and sentenced to 7 years in prison. But he isn't the only sinner to slither his way to freedom. In 2016, a Russian thief called Rustam Shakrudinov was locked up in the town of Izberbash. But he didn't stay there for long after squeezing his way through the cell's hatch, Ga-bak style. Unlike the master yogi, Rustam got stuck in the gap for over 2 minutes and the tight squeeze pulled his pants and underwear down. It isn't clear whether Rustam actually escaped the prison after getting out of his cell, but the embarrassing footage went viral and he was dubbed the Snake Man in Russia media. More like the Snaked Man if you ask me. Absconding Alcatraz. For years, Alcatraz was considered the most secure prison in the world due to its position on an island surrounded by the freezing San Francisco Bay. But this belief was shaken one morning in June 1962 when the guards discovered that the armed robber Frank Morris and the bank-robbing brothers John and Clarence Anglin had escaped from their cells. Their plan had been in the works since December 1961 and it originally involved another prisoner called Alan West. The 4 men spent months digging through the air vents at the back of their cells with spoons from the dining hall and a DIY drill they made from the motor of a vacuum cleaner. The drill was only used during Alcatraz's daily music hour, and Morris would play a concertina to drown out the drilling. When they finally broke through, they crafted fake air vent grills out of cardboard to disguise the holes and found that their tunnels led to a utility corridor. They used this space to build a raft made from 50 stolen raincoats sealed together with hot steam from a broken pipe, and once it was complete, they were ready to escape. On June 11th, the group left papier-mâché dummy heads in their beds made from toilet paper and real human hair that they stole from the barber shop. Then they squeezed through their tunnels, apart from West, who tried to reinforce the crumbling wall around his vent with cement and discovered that it had hardened and made the tunnel too narrow to enter. The other 3 had no reservations about leaving a man behind because they made it into the utility corridor and climbed up the pipes before accessing the roof through a ventilation shaft. From there, they snuck to the shore, inflated their raft by pumping air through Frank's concertina, and launched into the water, never to be seen again. When the dummies were discovered the following morning, a huge manhunt began, and 9 days later, the cops found shreds of the raft on a mainland beach. But incredibly, the men themselves were never found. The FBI continued their investigation until 1979 when they determined that the escapees probably drowned in the San Francisco Bay and closed their case. However, this was never proven, and the U.S. Marshal Service never closed their case, believing that there's a chance they all got away. The Marshal's warrant for their arrest won't expire until 2030 when they'll all be at least 100 years old. From that point, they'll no longer be able to be charged for the escape. So if Morris or the Anglin brothers survived and lived into very old age, they have the opportunity to step out of the shadows and do the funniest thing. Crabby criminals. When you were a kid, did you ever push against two walls to see if you could climb them like Jackie Chan? Well, in 2023, the convict Danilo Cavalcante did the same thing, and he managed to climb right out of Chester County Prison in Pennsylvania. Cavalcante was sentenced to life for, well, taking somebody else's life. But just days after his sentencing, he snuck to a corner of the prison's courtyard, braced his hands and feet against two parallel walls, and crab walked his way to the roof. From there, it was as easy as jumping over a razor wire fence to freedom before fleeing on foot. Thankfully, he was captured 13 days later in South Coventry Township and transferred to Green State Correctional Facility for the rest of his sentence. But the funny thing is, this escape wasn't unique, because just months earlier, Igor Vidra Bolte escaped from Chester County Prison in the exact same way. Bolte was a rock climber prior to his arrest for assault, so scaling the wall was no problem. But unlike Cavalcante, he was spotted and captured just 5 minutes after jumping over the prison's fence. How embarrassing. After this incident, security consultants were hired and more razor wire was installed to prevent other inmates from using the same escape route. But Cavalcante proved their measures weren't enough, and once he was recaptured, the prison finally sealed the gap that allowed the men to climb to freedom. Try crab walking out now, Cavalcante. I bet you Caval can't. Chapo's Chamber. With a nickname that translates to the Shorty, it might be surprising that El Chapo is considered one of the world's most feared crime lords. But since he started running the Mexican Sinaloa cartel in the 80s, Joaquin Guzman is believed to have made over $12 billion by committing almost every crime under the sun. This has attracted lots of attention from the cops, and Chapo's first arrest occurred in 1993 after a prominent archbishop was caught in a cartel shootout. He was sentenced to 20 years in Puente Grande prison, which was considered unescapable. But in 2001, he broke out by bribing guards to open a cell and wheel him to freedom in a laundry cart. 78 people were bribed, costing Chapo around $2.5 million. But he achieved freedom and continued to violently run the Sinaloa cartel, until he was caught and arrested again in 2014. He was put in solitary confinement with 24-hour surveillance in the Altiplano Federal Penitentiary with just 1 hour of outdoor exposure a day. It was incredibly secure, but on July 11, 2015, El slipped through the crack, seemingly vanished into thin air after going for a shower. But Chapo wasn't magic, and when the guards realized he'd escaped, they found that a hidden ladder in his shower led to a 4,309-foot-long tunnel, which had been built by the cartel right under their noses for months. This is still the longest escape tunnel ever discovered, and inside it was kitted out with lights, air ducts, and a motorcycle on tracks to make the escape faster. It led from Chapo's shower to a construction site in Santa Juanita, and Shorty successfully got out and went on the run. But unfortunately for him, the search effort was huge and he was captured in the coastal city of Lomochi 6 months later. This time, the Mexican government agreed to extradite Chapo to the USA, and he's currently serving life in America's most secure supermax prison, ADX Florence. He's being held in a solitary cell that's just 6 feet by 12 feet, so it looks like this time Chapo's going to stay locked up for good. I wouldn't get too cocky. If anyone can get out of there, the Shorty can. Rustling up a plan. Most people escape prison for their own personal freedom, but Stephen J. Russell is a con man who's broken out 4 times for a far more noble reason: love. Aww. See, while serving time for fraud and a previous prison escape in 1995, Russell met a fellow inmate called Philip Morris and immediately fell in love. But after the couple were both released later that year, Russell got himself back in hot water by embezzling $800,000 from a medical insurance company, all so he could shower Morris in gifts. He was arrested again in 1996 and sentenced to 45 years in jail with bail set at $900,000. But his love had no bounds, and he escaped by calling the district clerk's office and impersonating a judge to reduce his bail to $45,000. This allowed an accomplice to bail him out, but after 3 days of freedom, the authorities realized what he'd done and tracked him down before hauling him to Estelle Supermax Penitentiary in Texas. He stayed there for 5 months until he got bored and decided to escape again with an even more creative ploy. He noticed that the prison's doctors wore green scrubs that looked similar to a prisoner jumpsuit. So King Khan used a basin of water and marker pens to dye his jumpsuit green. Then, while the prison's receptionist was busy on the phone, he simply walked out undetected and met up with Philip in Biloxi, Mississippi. Unfortunately, he didn't lie low, and he was caught and rearrested after posing as a millionaire to fraudulently obtain a $75,000 loan from a bank in Dallas. But at this point, prison was practically daycare for Stephen Russell, and in 1998 he started his longest con yet, by convincing the prison that he had AIDS. He lost weight by taking laxatives and edited his medical records on the prison's typewriters. This convinced the authorities that he was dying, so they transferred him to a low-security hospice. Here he posed as his own doctor on the phone and informed the prison that unfortunately Stephen Russell had died. They bought it, and from there he was able to walk straight out the door to freedom. Unfortunately, the authorities eventually double-checked with the hospice, and when they explained that Stephen was still alive, the cops knew exactly where to find him. Predictably, Stephen had gone straight back to Phillips, so he was promptly found and arrested, before being sentenced to 144 years in solitary confinement for his constant escape attempts. Tragically, he was only caught because he just couldn't stay away from the love of his life. But after spending 26 years in solitary, he was released on parole in 2024 and permanently reunited with Philip, as long as he can stay out of trouble. Man, I love a happy ending. Air support. You can't get more gangster than Michel Vajour, a 74-year-old French bank robber who spent 27 years of his life in prison. With 6 jailbreaks under his belt, Vajour is a seasoned vet at escaping, but his greatest effort was only possible with the help of his loving wife, Nadine. In 1986, Michel was serving an 18-year sentence in Paris's Sainte prison for armed robbery. But since 1983, Nadine had been enrolling in flying lessons to obtain a helicopter pilot's license as part of an elaborate plan to bust him out. Once she qualified, she waited until May 26th and rented a helicopter from Paris Airfield before flying to the prison. As Nadine approached, Michel made his way to the prison's roof by first asking a guard to let him out of his cell for exercise and then threatening them with nectarines that he'd painted to look like grenades. Once he made it to the roof, Nadine lowered a rope ladder and the couple literally rode off into the sunset. But this love story doesn't have a happy ending because after 4 months on the run, they were both captured and locked up for their escape attempt. Talk about a high-risk date night. Incredibly, Vajour isn't the only convict who's attempted to escape with a helicopter. More recently, in 2013, Benjamin Hudson Barbeau and Danny Provencal made headlines when they escaped from Quebec's Saint Jerome prison with a chopper. 2 accomplices on the outside chartered a helicopter before forcing the pilot to fly over the prison. Then they lowered a rope and the 2 cons grabbed onto it to be towed to freedom. Unfortunately, while the escape looks impressive, it wasn't exactly discreet, and the authorities easily followed the chopper and arrested the escapees when it landed. So the Vajours and Canadian cons weren't successful, and unfortunately these helpicopters weren't so helpful after all. Man, I feel like a woman. Women make walking in heels look easy, but it can take years to learn how to strut around this effortlessly, and Ronald Silva found this out the hard way when his wobbly walk foiled his escape from prison. See, in 2012, he was awaiting trial for trafficking illicit substances when he tried and failed to perform an armed jailbreak. He was recaptured and placed back behind bars, so he decided that he needed to change tact by moving from brute force to beaut force. He arranged for his wife to visit him, and while she was there, they found a quiet corner to secretly exchange clothes. She left wearing his Bermuda shorts, and in return, he obtained her dress, bra, and high heels, as well as a wig. Silva had already shaved his arms and applied makeup before the visit, so after his wife left, he was able to walk straight out of jail, pretending to be a lady. He made it past the gates, but as he wobbled away in the high heels, a guard noticed and immediately suspected he was an escapee.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
So they reported Silva, and the cops picked him up at a nearby bus station and took him straight back to prison. The creative escape was a complete failure, but hilariously, Silva had to have another mugshot taken with his disguise on, giving us this incredible picture of a disgruntled felon in full drag. Do you think he feels bonita? Because he looks bonita. A stick up. If you want the textbook definition of an American gangster, look no further than John Dillinger. Widely regarded as America's first celebrity criminal, he was the leader of the fearsome and uncreatively named Dillinger Gang, who conducted a series of violent bank robberies throughout 1933. In 1934, the gang was rounded up and arrested, and Dillinger was extradited to Lake County Jail where he awaited trial. But John was wily and well-connected, and he convinced his attorney's investigator, Arthur O'Leary, to procure a fake gun from a woodworker and smuggle it in for him. The gangster then used it to threaten the guards into freeing him, and he scared them so badly he was able to walk out of the jail, steal the sheriff's car, and drive to Chicago. But this turned out to be a bad move because driving a stolen vehicle across state lines was the first federal law that old Johnny broke. This got the FBI involved, and ultimately the feds tracked him down and fatally brought him to justice 4 months later in a shootout. So the arts and crafts firearm could have worked if Dillinger didn't take the sheriff's car, and let this be a lesson, kids. Don't steal cars. Stick to bank robberies instead. Mail order inmate. My mom always used to say, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Wise words to live by for sure, but some people take that nugget of wisdom way too close to heart. Richard Lee McNair is a con who broke out of prison not once, not twice, but 3 times while serving a life sentence. His first 2 attempts saw him promptly recaptured. However, his final escape was one of the most creative jailbreaks of all time after he successfully mailed himself out of the United States Penitentiary in Pollock, Louisiana. Richard had been in prison for 12 years straight, and he'd been trusted with a job that involved repairing torn mailbags. This inspired him to escape again in April 2006 as he fitted one of the mailbags he was repairing with a breathing tube before climbing inside. Then the prison staff used a forklift to carry the bag out of the prison to a nearby warehouse, and when they went for lunch, McNair cut himself out and started running away. Richard was free, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. Hours later, the authorities discovered his escape and started their search, and McNair was stopped on the side of the road by a policeman named Carl Borderland.
Where you live at?
Down the road by Pineville.
Pineville?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Do you have any form of identification on you?
No, man.
What's your name?
Robert Jones.
Robert Jones? What is, we got an escapee.
Oh. Where from?
Prison.
There's a prison here?
Yeah.
They talked for 10 minutes, and although McNair gave Borderland 2 different names and couldn't provide a home address, he managed to convince the cop that he was a civilian who was out for a run. Borderland let him go, and McNair evaded the authorities for 17 months as he snuck into Canada and traveled around in stolen cars. He thought he'd gotten away with it, but in October 2007, a cop in New Brunswick happened to run the plates of a van that McNair had stolen, completely unaware that it was harboring a wanted fugitive. This led to McNair's arrest, which exposed his identity and got him thrown back in prison in the U.S., where he remains today. Man, I hope the prison has a drama department. With acting chops like that, Richard belongs on the stage. No face, no case. Going on the run involves constantly looking over your shoulder, knowing that if one person recognizes you, you could end up back behind bars. For the infamous British robber Ronnie Biggs, this wasn't an option, so he decided to go under the knife for some facial reconstruction. This lifelong crook was involved in the Great Train Robbery of 1963, in which a Royal Mail train carrying cash from Glasgow to London was robbed. The 15-member crew took control of a signal light to stop and board the train, and they ultimately got away with £2.6 million, which is worth around $66 million today. After the robbery, the crew hid out at Leatherslade Farm, where they played a game of Monopoly with the money they stole. But the police later found the hideout and recovered some fingerprints, and 12 of the robbers, including Biggs, were caught and convicted. Biggs was sentenced to 30 years in Wandsworth Prison, but unsurprisingly, he wasn't happy with this arrangement. So in July 1965, he successfully escaped by getting an accomplice to throw a rope ladder over a prison wall before driving him away in a van. But Ronnie knew that getting out of prison is only half the challenge, and the real test is not getting caught, Biggs fled to Europe by boat and headed to Paris, where he spent the equivalent of over $1 million on plastic surgery and fake identity papers. Cosmetic surgery back then was a lot more basic, but it had been used to successfully alter people's appearances, and Ronnie's was good enough that he and his family were able to flee undetected to Melbourne, Australia. After 3 years, Interpol tracked him down, so he left his family and fled to Brazil. 4 years later, the authorities found him again, but they discovered that he had a new girlfriend who was pregnant, and Brazil had a law that didn't allow the parents of a Brazilian child to be extradited to another country. So despite being caught red-handed, Ronnie was allowed to continue living in Brazil as a free man, and he became a famous figure with tourists who flew out to meet him. This continued until 2001, when he suffered from 3 strokes and voluntarily returned to the UK to receive free health care. The cops finally rearrested the 72-year-old Biggs, but only because he handed himself in. It turns out if you want to evade the cops, all you need to have is some plastic surgery and a Brazilian baby. Triple threat. As soon as you label a prison as inescapable, you're just asking for a jailbreak. And back in World War II, the German military found that out the hard way. Stalag Luft III was a POW camp for Air Force personnel that took great measures to foil any escape attempts. Most of its huts were built on stilts so tunnels would be more visible, and microphones were buried in the ground to pick up the noise of any digging. But under the supervision of a South African squadron leader called Roger Bushell, 3 tunnels were built named Tom, Dick, and Harry. Over 600 men helped to dig using their empty ration tins, and the tunnels themselves were hidden under stoves in a drain 30 feet below the surface to avoid the microphones. Inside, they were just 2 square feet in size and reinforced with wood taken from bed frames, making it a very tight squeeze. Now obviously all the excavated soil couldn't be shoveled up to the surface, so the prisoners hid sacks in their pants, which they would discreetly open when walking outside, depositing the dirt right under the guards' noses. After digging for a year, Dick was abandoned and Tom was discovered by the Germans and blown up. But they continued to work on Harry, and it got so long that the men created makeshift pumps out of hockey sticks and knapsacks to fill the tunnel with breathable air. Finally, on the night of March 24, 1944, the 334-foot tunnel was ready, and 200 men prepared to clamber under the stove and escape. But as the first men crawled up to Harry's exit at around 10:30 p.m., they found that it was frozen shut. Breaking the ice took an hour and a half, and once the first men climbed out, they realized that they hadn't dug far enough to reach the woods around the camp, and the exit was just a stone's throw from the fence. Still, the escapees started funneling through and running for the woods until 1 a.m. when the tunnel collapsed behind them. The prisoners hurriedly repaired it and continued the escape, but at 4:55 a.m. a night guard spotted an escapee emerging from the exit. The guards quickly searched the huts and found the tunnel, and of the 200 men who had planned to escape, only 76 managed to get away. Worse still, within 2 weeks, 73 of them had been recaptured, and only 3 men got out of Germany. Despite this lack of success, the dirt depositing system and makeshift air pumps that the men created were incredible, and the attempt soon became known as the Great Escape. Countless books and movies have been made about the plan, and today it's undoubtedly one of the most iconic prison breaks of all time. Empire State Escape. You may associate the words Matt and sweat with working out at the gym, which, as you can see, I do regularly. But in 2015, Richard Matt and David Sweat made headlines for breaking out of prison and going on the run through New York State. The criminals met while they were both serving life sentences at Clinton Correctional Facility, and they immediately hit it off and began planning an escape. They started by seducing the prisoner's tailor, Joyce Mitchell, and convincing her to smuggle them hacksaws that they could use to cut out of their cells. After months of sawing, they broke into a utility area which allowed them to cut into a large steam pipe that they hoped would lead into the sewers. On June 5, 2015, Matt and Sweat left makeshift dummies in their beds to buy them time, packed supplies into a guitar case, and crawled through the steam pipe until they emerged from a manhole outside the prison walls. They had their freedom, but then things started to go wrong. They'd arranged for Joyce to pick them up in a getaway car, but she chickened out and never showed. So the Cons had to improvise and escape on foot as a giant manhunt got underway. They evaded capture for 3 weeks and traveled around 40 miles towards the Canadian border, but after a failed attempt to violently hijack a car, Matt was taken out by the cops. Then 3 days later, Sweat was discovered and captured in a field near Constable, New York, only a couple miles from the border. He was hauled to Five Points Correctional Facility to continue serving his life sentence as well as additional charges of first-degree escape. And I'm sure those last few miles to the Canadian border will haunt him for the rest of his life. So close, yet so far. Is it just me, or does anyone else have an urge to start digging a tunnel? Which one of these insane prison escapes did you dig the most? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching.